The first cold rain of October fell on the Oregon frontier, like a curtain pulled across the sky. It came steady and cold. The kind of rain that soaked everything it touched and warned every family in the valley that winter was coming, whether they were ready or not. Most settlers in the hills outside the young town of Eugene knew what that meant. Wet boots, wet blankets, wet walls, and worst of all, wet firewood. It was the same misery every year, but one man chose to fight that misery in a way nobody understood. His name was Luke Harrington, a quiet 34-year-old homesteader who worked alone and spoke little. While his neighbors hurried to stack firewood under leaking sheds, Luke was doing something that made no sense to anyone watching. He had cut a square hole right through the floor of his cabin and was hauling buckets of earth up through a trap door, like he was digging himself into trouble. From the outside, it looked like madness. From the inside, it was the beginning of something no one in that valley had ever seen. If stories of forgotten frontier wisdom interest you, feel free to stay with this one. It holds a lesson worth remembering. The rain hammered the roof as neighbors gathered around Luke's cabin, watching him lift another bucket of soil. Tom Wheeler, a Kentucky farmer who believed he understood every trick worth knowing, shook his head. "Luke, that floor's going to bury you alive," he called through the open doorway. "You're digging your own grave under there." Luke didn't answer. His hands moved in a steady rhythm. Bucket up, bucket down. The sound of iron on damp earth echoing beneath the cabin. The hole grew deeper with each passing day. 6 feet, 10 feet. The man wasn't building a root cellar. He wasn't storing potatoes. He wasn't doing anything that fit the logic of frontier life. Even Mary Whitman, a Chanotito with a sharp mind and a good eye for practical work, leaned down through the trap door one morning and tried to understand the plan. "Luke, I've seen storm shelters," she said softly. "This isn't one. What exactly are you making?" Luke brushed the dirt from his hands and answered with a single word. "Dry." It wasn't a full explanation. It wasn't enough to silence the whispers, but it was the truth. The Willamette Valley swallowed moisture the way the plains swallowed dust. Everything stayed damp from the first October rain until late spring. Men spent half their firewood just fighting the smoke that came from burning soggy logs. Families coughed through the winter. Children slept close to the stove because the heat never reached the corners of the room. Luke had lived through 2 of those winters. He would not live through a third the same way. He kept digging. By late October, the pit under his cabin stretched nearly 30 feet long and more than 16 feet wide. His neighbors, crowded under dripping hats, stood outside shaking their heads. They told each other the same thing. The man had lost his mind. Then came the moment that made them even more certain. Luke began lining the earthen walls with smooth river stones, hundreds of them, then thousands. He arranged each one carefully, dry stacked without mortar, fitting them together like pieces of a puzzle. Stone holds cold," Mary warned. "You're building a box of ice." "Not for cold," Luke said, "for dry." The rain kept falling, the valley kept soaking, and the man kept building. When he finished the stonework, he added something stranger still. 2 wooden ventilation shafts, one rising from the northeast corner of the chamber, the other from the southwest. They ran straight up through the cabin floor and out the roof, each covered by a small cap to keep the rain out. Yet to every man standing in the mud outside that cabin, it looked like a mistake carved from stubbornness. To Luke, it looked like a promise. He didn't speak much, but he drew in the dirt when words failed him. He showed them how warm air would rise through one shaft, while cool air sank through the other, creating a gentle, constant flow. A flow that would carry moisture out. A flow that would keep firewood from molding, rotting, or smoking. Yet the neighbors only saw a man trying to outsmart the rain. And in Oregon, nobody outsmarted the rain. But Mary Whitman watched more closely. Her late husband had taught her how heat moved, how air behaved when temperatures stayed steady. She noticed how Luke tested the soil in summer, how he checked elevation, how he spoke not from guesswork, but from quiet conviction. "You really believe this will work?" she asked him one evening as the light faded behind the trees. Luke looked up from the stones and nodded. "It has to. Because winter was coming. Firewood was scarce, and the valley would soon drown in cold rain that turned every cabin into a smoky box of damp misery. Luke's chamber was nearly ready, but no one yet understood what he had built, and no one imagined how soon they would need it. The rain grew heavier as November settled across the Oregon foothills. It came in long gray sheets that swallowed the forest, blurred the fields, and turned every trail into a rope of mud. The Harrington cabin stood like a stubborn island in a rising sea of waterlogged earth. Inside, Luke checked the joists overhead, making sure his strange underground chamber would hold through the storms. Most men patched leaks. Luke built something that had never existed in that valley. One early morning, Robert Clay, a former railroad worker who trusted measurements more than opinions, he stepped inside Luke's home and climbed down the narrow trapdoor ladder. His boots landed on a floor of fresh river gravel. He paused. The air was not cold. It was not warm. It was something else. Steady. Still. Calm. "Luke, this feels different than any cellar I've been in," Robert said softly. "Different is why it works," Luke answered. Robert ran his hand along the stone wall. Dry. Bone dry. No moisture. No chill. No trace of the wet earth pressing on the other side. Yet he lifted a lantern and inspected the ventilation shafts rising toward the roof. He watched the faint flicker of the flame lean gently. Pulled by airflow, he could not hear, but could clearly see. Convection, a force as old as the earth itself, harnessed by a man who had no teacher but experience. Robert climbed back up without a word. He didn't laugh. He didn't mock. He simply walked home, mind full of questions he didn't yet know how to ask. Outside, the neighbors stood in the rain, waiting for him to confirm their suspicions. "Well, did he build a grave or a miracle?" someone asked. Robert hesitated. "I don't know what he built," he admitted, "but it's not a grave." That was the first shift in the valley. A small one, but real. As days passed, the storm thickened. Canvas tarps sagged under puddled water. Wood piles darkened from black to nearly ink. The smell of wet bark filled every home. Fireplaces hissed and fought to stay lit. Smoke curled low across cabin ceilings, irritating throats and stinging eyes. But in Luke's home, the fire burned steady and bright. Last year's wood, kept in the loft where rain could never reach, burned clean and Every morning and every evening, he carried a lantern down into the chamber below. He checked each row of firewood he'd stacked in early December. Fresh, green logs split only weeks before, wet wood by any normal standard. He tested pieces with his hand, and he lifted them to check weight. He looked for mold. There was none. He listened for dripping, for the telltale sound of moisture collecting in cellars. There was nothing, only the faint whisper of dry air moving. If you appreciate true frontier survival wisdom, this moment is where the lesson begins. Neighbors struggled. Tom Wheeler spent 40 minutes every dawn coaxing a flame from soggy alder. His home barely reached 55 degrees. Luke used less. Because he had something Luke used less. Because he had something they didn't. Wood that dried while rain fell. By mid-December, the chamber was doing something no one believed possible. Luke split a test log and saw thin cracks spreading from the center outward. Signs of a wood losing water fast. I wordlessly dropped the piece into the flames. It caught quickly, cleanly. No steam, no struggle, no hiss. Tom's jaw tightened as he watched it burn. "That wood's only been cut 6 weeks," he whispered. "No stack in this valley could dry it like that." Luke nodded. "Underground stays the same temperature," he said. "Air keeps moving. Wood lets go." Tom leaned against the cabin wall, shaken in a way he could not hide. He had mocked Luke for months. Now he felt the sting of being wrong. Still, he asked the question every man in the settlement secretly carried. "How did you know this would work?" Luke looked toward the trap door. His voice was quiet. "Where I was raised, winter killed the unprepared. You learn to think before you freeze." It was the closest thing to a confession he ever gave. The wind rattled the shutters as the rain roared louder. The valley seemed ready to flood. Homes smelled of damp smoke. Families wrapped blankets around their shoulders to keep warm. Luke walked to the trap door again. Something in the air had changed. A feeling. A shift. The kind that meant his underground chamber was about to prove itself in a way no one could ignore. "Wait, before we move on. If these frontier survival stories touch your heart, it in years, and every family in that valley in years, and every family in that valley was about to learn whether the man they mocked had been foolish, or the only one who truly understood the land." Wind crashed through the treetops like rolling thunder. Rain fell in sheets so heavy it sounded like stones striking the cabin roofs. The Willamette Valley had seen wet winters before, but nothing like this. By dawn, trails had become small rivers. Wood piles, carefully stacked under sheds and tarps, had turned into sponges. Families woke to smoke-choked rooms, coughing children, and stoves that refused to stay lit. But inside Luke Harrington's cabin, a soft, steady warmth filled the air. He struck one match. Only one. A single dry piece of wood from his underground chamber caught flame almost instantly. And he didn't need kindling. He didn't need to blow on embers. He didn't need to fight moisture that wasn't there. The fire answered him like a loyal friend. Meanwhile, across the valley, neighbors struggled. Tom Wheeler's cabin filled with bitter smoke. His wood hissed on the stove and released steam instead of heat. He spent nearly an hour trying to warm his home. His wife wrapped blankets around their daughters as they shivered. Mary Whitman's chimney clogged again from burning wet spruce. Sparks leaped into the room each time she opened the stove door. She worried through the night that a fire would catch the rafters. At sunrise, she stepped outside into the freezing rain and stared down the valley at Luke's cabin. A thin line of clean, blue smoke drifted straight up from his chimney. No sputtering, no choking, just steady burn. It didn't seem possible. By noon, neighbors were desperate. One by one, they trudged through the mud and rain toward Luke's home. Yet Tom Wheeler was first. Mary followed with a scarf over her mouth to keep out the cold. Robert Clay arrived with his measuring kit under his arm. When Luke opened the door, warm air spilled out around him like a quiet invitation. Tom stepped inside and froze. The cabin was nearly 65 degrees, dry, clear, comfortable. The stove burned hot with a flame that danced bright and clean. It looked like a July fire, not a January struggle. "What kind of wood burns like that after this storm?" Tom asked. Luke didn't answer. He walked to the trap door and lifted it. A dry breath of cool air rose from below. "See?" he said. "Still working?" One by one, they climbed down the narrow stairs. And the moment their boots touched the gravel floor, every doubt they ever spoke about Luke's idea vanished. The chamber was dry, completely dry. No damp stones, no smell of rot, no sweating walls. The light from the lanterns flickered across rows of perfectly seasoned wood, wood that had been green 6 weeks earlier. Robert ran a hand along the stacked logs. "Impossible," he whispered. Mary held her lantern near the ventilation shaft. The flame leaned gently toward the draft, proof of the constant airflow Luke had described months before. "It's breathing," she murmured. "The chamber is breathing." Luke nodded. Air always moving, wood always drying. He picked up a log and placed it in Tom's hands. Tom weighed it. The surprise was immediate. Light. Half of what it should have been. "How did you dry this faster than the sun?" he asked. Luke smiled softly. "The earth helps, if we learn how to listen." The neighbors stood in silence, humbled by what they saw. This wasn't madness. This wasn't guesswork. This was careful, deliberate understanding of soil, temperature, airflow, and time. This was frontier engineering, born from quiet observation. The next week changed the entire valley. Word spread to nearby settlements. Woodsmen, farmers, widows, and builders walked miles through the rain to study Luke's chamber. Some sketched diagrams. Some took notes. Some simply stood inside and marveled at how comfortable the air felt beneath the earth. By February, several families began digging their own chambers. Luke helped each one, refusing payment. He walked property lines. It built the third. Robert Clay designed one, built the third. Robert Clay designed one with larger ventilation shafts, improving airflow even further. And when the next winter came, something remarkable happened. Those who had laughed at Luke the year before no longer struggled to keep fires lit. Their homes burned warm. Their wood lasted longer. But their children coughed less. Their chimneys stayed clean. Their fuel bills dropped nearly in half. All because one quiet man dug a hole that everyone thought was foolish. Luke never called it a miracle. He never claimed to be brilliant. He only said one thing whenever someone thanked him. "Dry wood burns clean. Warm homes make strong families. That's enough." Years later, Mary Whitman wrote in her journal, "Luke Harrington changed this valley, not with a gun or a plow or a speech. And he did it with patience. He did it with thought. He did it by trusting that the earth held answers if we were willing to listen." Luke lived long enough to see dozens of underground chambers across the region. Families who had once mocked him now built better lives because of his idea. By the time he died in 1891, the valley understood something essential about him. He hadn't just kept his firewood dry. He had kept his people warm. He had kept them safe. He had kept them alive. And the lesson he left behind was simple. Innovation doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers beneath your feet, waiting for someone brave enough to dig. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe for more true frontier wisdom and lost American stories that deserve to be remembered.